Good afternoon, and welcome to the William G. McGowan Theater here at the National Archives. I'm David Ferriero, the Archivist of the United States, and I'm pleased you could join us for today's program, whether you're here in the theater or joining us through Facebook or YouTube. Before we hear from Stephanie E. Jones-Rogers about her new book, They Were Her Property, White Women as Slave Owners in the American South, I'd like to tell you about two other programs coming up here in the McGowan Theater. Tomorrow at noon, Margaret Sarter and Alex Harris will tell you about their new book, Where We Find Ourselves, the photographs of Hugh Mangum, 1897 to 1922. Mangum was an itinerant portraitist in North Carolina and Virginia, working during the rise of Jim Crow, and his forgotten glass plate negatives were discovered in the 1970s. On Thursday, May 2nd at noon, historian Michael Dobbs will share the story of a group of German Jews who desperately sought to escape Nazi Germany. His new book, The Unwanted, America, Auschwitz, and a Village Caught in Between, also describes America's response to the refugee crisis of the 1930s and 40s. Check our website at archives.gov or sign up at the table outside the theater to get email updates. You'll also find information about other National Archives activities and programs. And another way to get more involved with the National Archives is to become a member of the National Archives Foundation. The foundation supports all of our education and outreach activities. Visit its website, archivesfoundation.org, to learn more about the foundation. Questioning assumptions about history gives us a fresh understanding of our past. Digging into primary sources helps us uncover and listen to the voices of those who haven't usually been heard. Today's guest author, Stephanie Jones-Rogers, has done this in her new book, They Were Her Property, White Women as Slave Owners in the American South. Jones-Rogers uses an impressive assortment of records to piece together the stories of the slaveholders and the enslaved, WPA oral histories of formerly enslaved people, newspaper advertisements, sales records, legal documents, court records, and more. 2 weeks ago here at the National Archives, we displayed the D.C. Emancipation Act, which ended slavery in the District of Columbia in 1862. Among the records generated as a result of this law, you'll find several references to women owners. Teresa Soffel and Elizabeth Ringgold, for example, sought compensation for their freed slaves, with Ringgold claiming that Perry Goodwin, a gift from her sister, was worth $1,500. They Were Her Property has received a number of highly favorable reviews. Rebecca Onion, writing for Slate, calls it a stunning new book. Payroll Sengal of the New York Times said it is a taut and cogent corrective that examines how historians have misunderstood and misrepresented white women as reluctant actors. And in the Washington Post, Elizabeth Varon writes, Jones-Rogers has provided a brilliant, innovative analysis of American slavery, one that sets a new standard for scholarship on the subject. Stephanie Jones-Rogers is an associate professor of history at the University of California, Berkeley, where she specializes in African American history, women's and gender history, and the history of American slavery. They Were Her Property is based on her revised dissertation, which won the Organization of American Historians Lerner Scott Prize for the best doctoral dissertation in U.S. women's history in 2013. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Stephanie Jones-Rogers.
Thank you so much for that invitation. The invitation and the introduction, David, and thank you all for coming this afternoon and spending your lunchtime with me. It's truly a pleasure to be here with you today. So this is James Redpath, and in 1859, after touring the antebellum South, he attempted to explain for his readers why white Southern women opposed Southern emancipation. He believed that their sentiments were tied to a lifetime of indoctrination, reared as they were under the shadow of the peculiar institution. Slavery was, quote, incessantly praised and defended, end quote, virtually everywhere these women went, by everyone they knew, and in most of the publications that they read. Their consciences were thus easily perverted, Redpath argued, were never afterwards appealed to. with the result that they saw no reason to change their views. Redpath assumed that white Southern women did not know Negro slavery as it is because their society shielded them from the institution's horrific realities. Insulated by Southern patriarchs, he argued, white women seldom saw slavery's, quote, most obnoxious features, end quote. They never, quote, never attend auctions, end quote, never witness what were called examinations, seldom, if ever, saw, quote, the Negroes lashed, end quote. More profoundly, they did not know that the interstate slave and trade in slaves was a gigantic commerce. Southern men revealed only the South Side view of slavery, Redpath surmised, and if the women of the South knew slavery as it is, he was convinced they would join in the protests against it. Redpath's assumptions represent a commonly held patriarchal view, yet narrative sources, legal and financial documents, and military and government correspondence make it clear that white Southern women knew the most obnoxious features of slavery all too well. Slave-owning women not only witnessed the most brutal features of slavery, they took part in them, profited from them, and defended them. After hearing what James Redpath said about white women's relationship to slavery, we might think that white women were invisible in Southern slave markets. They are most notably absent from this painting from 1854, which depicts a very public slave auction in the city of Charleston, South Carolina. Or we might think of them as distanced from the horrors of the market, from the sales, but also from the traumatic separations that came after those sales were finalized. We might think that white women and their children were merely passive observers of all this, and more profoundly, that they were powerless to stop these horrors and traumatic separations, like what you see in this image. This image is a depiction of the kind of trauma and the violence of those separations that occurred after a slave auction took place and an enslaved person was sold away from their family. And highlighted in the yellow box towards the left-hand side of the image, you can see a white woman and a child distanced from that separation, distanced from that horror and that trauma, separated from and indirectly witnessed to, but experiencing that, but not directly implicated in the violence and the trauma of the market. But this is not how enslaved and formerly enslaved people remembered things at all. First, they made it clear that white Southern women's economic relationships to slavery began in childhood, and in some cases during infancy, not just in adulthood. Fillmore Hancock, for example, told his interviewer that his grandmother, quote, was given to the missus as her own on the day she was born. Remarkably, Fillmore Hancock recalled that old Mrs. was only a year old then, so his grandmother was given to her mistress when she was only 1 year old. Enslaved people and formerly enslaved people talked about the lifelong processes of socialization by which white girls came to understand themselves as markedly different than enslaved people, and the rituals that drove this point home for enslaved and free people alike. White slave-owning girls also made it clear that they had the power to claim other African Americans as their property when they selected specific enslaved children to serve them. When Betty Coffer was born, for example, her master's daughter, Ella, was only a little girl, but she nevertheless claimed Betty Coffer as her slave shortly after Betty was born. They played together and grew up together, Betty recalled. Eventually, Betty became Ella's personal servant, waiting on her, standing behind her chair during mealtimes, and sleeping beside her on the bedroom floor. More profoundly, formerly enslaved people tell us that this process of socialization was effective. White girls often made claims of ownership in their conversations with enslaved people. A formerly enslaved woman named Melinda recalled that her young mistress would frequently tell her, "When I get big and get married to a prince, you come with me and tend all my chillins." And when her mistress did in fact marry, she took Melinda with her as part of their new household. As Southern girls, young white women thought about how enslaved people would fit into their lives, not just as playmates or companions, but as property. And when they were old enough, they turned their imaginings into reality. Formerly enslaved people remarked upon how this process of socialization also involved lessons about slave management and discipline, what we would typically refer to as slave mastery. Nancy Thomas recalled that she was the special little girl for her mistress Harriet's daughter, Polonia, and that even during them days, she would sew and knit. Nancy went on to say how she had a little three-legged stool and she'd set it between Polonia's legs while she was sitting down. Then Polonia would watch her while she knitted. If she did something wrong, Polonia would pinch Nancy's ear a little and say, "You dropped a stitch, Nanny." As Nancy Thomas's testimony shows, Polonia Smith was what I refer to as a mistress in the making, responsible for overseeing the production of the enslaved girl she would come to own and disciplining her when it did not meet her requirements. So serving as the metaphorical flies on the walls of Southern households, formerly enslaved people talked about some of the most violent, traumatic, and intimate dimensions of life for those who were bound and those who were free. They heard and saw things that typically remained obscured from view, details that white slave-owning couples often left out of their personal correspondence or public communications. That is, when they were able to write at all. Many of the slave-owning women I discuss in this book contended with some form of illiteracy. They were either unable to write and read or possessed the ability to do one but not the other. Enslaved and formerly enslaved people's recollections about their female owners thus serve as some of the only archival records about these women to survive. This book takes its cue from formerly enslaved people. No group spoke about white women's investments in slavery more often or more powerfully than the enslaved people subjected to their ownership and control. They were the people whose lives were forever changed when a mistress sold someone just so that she could buy a new dress. They were best equipped to describe the agony that shook their bodies and souls when they returned from their errands to discover that their children were gone and their mistresses were counting piles of money they had received from the slave traders who'd bought them. Only enslaved people could speak about their female owners' profound economic contributions to their continued enslavement with such astonishing precision. So what did formerly enslaved people have to say about white females' economic relationships to the institution of slavery? Formerly enslaved people's interviews offer insight into the most intimate workings of white households as well. Formerly enslaved people like Mary Kinchy and Edwards, who you see pictured here, for example, tell us that in some households, breastfeeding constituted another form of labor that slave owners required enslaved women to perform. For Warren Taylor's mother, for example, nursing white children was one of her primary jobs. But for enslaved mothers like Mary Kinchy and Edwards, nursing white children was the only work they performed during slavery. These recollections make it clear that white mothers didn't simply use enslaved mothers to breastfeed their children because of physiological ailments that resulted in inadequate milk supply and inability to produce milk at all, or as a last resort. But they compelled enslaved mothers to perform this labor as a matter of course in some households. Moreover, in order for enslaved women to serve in this capacity consistently, they also had to give birth or at the very least lactate on a routine basis. But what often remains unexplored is what led to these constant conceptions in the first place. While enslaved women performed the most arduous forms of labor in their own owners' fields and in their households, they also had to conceive, carry a pregnancy to full term, give birth, and lactate in order to be able to serve as wet nurses in the first place. and sources suggest that this is precisely what happened. Some of the enslaved women's children were undoubtedly conceived within relationships of love, but others were undoubtedly the result of sexual assault. So how widespread was this phenomenon? Widespread enough that a niche market, a very small corner, but nevertheless a significant corner of the slave market, emerged in order to fulfill white mothers' demands for enslaved wet nurses. The market in enslaved wet nurses was primarily a hiring one. But these ads reveal that some of the enslaved women and mothers were offered for sale, and that their capacity to serve as wet nurses was a selling point. So these are just three examples of some of the newspaper advertisements that I collected as part of the research for this book, which reflect a number of things. One, that white mothers were creating such a demand for enslaved mothers' services and labor as wet nurses that they were not only placing these ads in Southern newspapers, but that also, what you don't see in these, but in others, what also becomes clear is that white women were also some of the individuals who were supplying these white mothers with the enslaved mothers and wet nurses that they wanted, that they were seeking. Here, these three are examples of enslaved wet nurses seeking wet nurses either to purchase or to hire. And what I found also is that there was a really important intersection and connection between the market in enslaved wet nurses and the slave market proper. So most of the men and individuals who were offering enslaved women for sale to serve in this capacity were also slave traders who made their living buying and selling enslaved people. So in addition to that, when we attend very closely to what enslaved and formerly enslaved people had to say about white women's economic investments in slavery, it becomes clear that they had so much to tell us about the institution of slavery and the roles that white women played in the slave market economy and in their continued captivity. We learned that when they said that they belonged to white women, they meant belonged to by law. Sally Nightingale owned Alice Marshall and her mother, for example, and Marcia claimed that her mistress's husband, Jack, ain't had nothing to do with me and my mother because they belonged to the missus by law and not her husband. So what you see here is what is referred to as a lost friends ad. Also, typically they were referred to as information wanted ads. And these are very unique in large part because they emerge right as the Civil War is coming to an end and also in the years following the Civil War. And what they reflect is formerly enslaved people's attempts to reconstitute their families. So all of those individuals who belonged to their families and communities that had been sold away from them, that they wanted to reconnect with, family members, that children and mothers and fathers and even brothers and uncles who they had lost contact with because of sale and separation, they placed these ads in order to try to reconnect with those individuals, to find those people and to reconstitute their families. And so these advertisements also show more than simply their attempts to reconnect with their families, but they also show how those separations occurred in the first place. And they highlight, in many of them, they highlight the owners who were responsible not simply for their sale, but their separation. Here what I'm showing is an advertisement placed by Caroline Mason seeking information about her family members. And so what she says here is that she was owned by Betsy Mason, a white woman, and was sold by her as well. So she doesn't simply say, that she, inadvertently was sold by some man who was related to Betsy. She identifies Betsy as her legal owner, but also the person who was ultimately responsible for the separations that occurred after those sales took place. This is another advertisement which goes a little bit farther, more deeper, and shows more complex elements or dimensions of slavery. William May's advertisement highlights several things, not simply about white slave-owning women and their families, but also their business practices. So he not only identifies his female owner, Telelise Stokes, in this advertisement, he also described the conflicts within her family over her property and her property rights. He argues, or he tells us, that Jack Sampson, his owner's grandson, stole his mother and siblings from Telelise. So a grandson and a grandmother, he is not willing to recognize the kind of inviolability of Telelise Stokes's property rights in this particular case. But what he also tells us is that while Telelise Stokes held legal title to him while she was his owner, that she would hire him out. So he refers to this process of hiring out as living with Jimson at the time. So in the top element, he talks about Jack Simpson's decision to sell him away from his family, to steal his family away from him, and also talks about Telelise's business practices, meaning she would hire him out and then receive his wages in return for the labor that he performed for Jimson in this particular case. And here, it's really, these sources really get at some of the again, these more complex dimensions of slavery that often don't enter into the kind of popular understanding of the institution and of the ways in which enslaved people were passed between people, how those separations occurred, etc. So here, what Guy Smith is telling us is that he and his wife were separated from their children, and that his children were drawn, refers to a process called being drawn by different members of his owner's family, some of whom were women. But in doing so, he also talks about the legal process by which these separations took place. He doesn't use all the terms that we would like that we would think to look for, but he very plainly tells us that while these separations of family members didn't take place in the slave market, they nonetheless brought about the same kinds of traumatic severances from loved ones. So what he tells us is that this process of being drawn and falling to someone refers to the process that happens during an estate, the administration of a deceased person's estate in this particular context. So his owner dies, and then after that owner died, all of his property was then, they would in fact have a drawing, so very much like a lottery. So they would put the names of the individual heirs into a bag or hat, and that individual heir the name would also be written alongside a group of enslaved people, or that person would draw. So they would draw either their names out of a hat, and then that person would then be told what property they received, or they would draw out a piece of paper that had a list of the property that they would receive. So there are a variety of ways that this ritual took place. And so they literally did, in fact, draw enslaved people as a part of this estate division process. And so that's what Guy is referring to here. And so this is not simply something that enslaved people talked about in terms that aren't necessarily proper legalese, but these recollections are also reflected in documents that appear in archival collections throughout the South. What you see here is a handwritten document that shows exactly what Guy Smith is referring to, an estate division in which it lists the individual enslaved people that are a part of that deceased person's estate. And it also shows the ages of those enslaved people. It shows the values, the estimated values of those enslaved people. And then towards the bottom, at the very bottom of this document, it shows which heirs drew which enslaved people. And so what I thought was really remarkable about this document, and in relationship to what Guy shows in his Lost Friends ad, is that Elizabeth Henry, the very top line there, Elizabeth Henry drew more enslaved people than the other heir, Richard Henry, did. And why is this important? What I show in the book is that colonial historians, so historians who look at slavery in the colonial period in the country, have shown that slave-owning parents would typically give their daughters more slaves than any other form of property. They would give them other property, and they would give them money, and they would give them, in some cases I've seen stocks and bonds given to daughters, but they would often give their daughters far more enslaved people than other forms of property, particularly land. And they would give their sons the land, so that when that couple got together, they would have everything they needed to get a start on that new life that they were going to be living. I see the same thing happen in the 19th century. So throughout the 19th century, you see similar patterns where slaveholding parents would also give their daughters more enslaved people than land. And this is reflective of the fact that even if Richard did not receive land, he actually, you can see that kind of inheritance practice play out here in this document by showing that Elizabeth received more slaves than the other heir, which might suggest also that he received land in addition to receiving those enslaved people. And so I think these sources are really important to showing kind of the process by which I wrote the book, because I centered and foregrounded the experiences of the accounts and reflections of formerly enslaved people in order to lead me in more productive directions and additional directions in relationship to the sources. So by looking at just fragments of information, data, for those scientists that might be in the room or mathematically inclined folks in the room, by using the data that formerly enslaved people provided, I was able to piece together some of the details of the lives of the female owners that they identify. And so this is a really important or a really interesting example of that process for me. So James Skinner was a reverend who lived in Yazoo County, Mississippi. And on November 20th, 1879, he placed this Lost Friends ad in the Southwestern Christian Advocate because he was looking for his brother Edward. And so the last time John had seen Edward was on October 12th, 1860 in Georgetown and in the District of Columbia, right where we are today. And so not long after the brothers crossed paths that day, John and his family were forced to leave Edward behind when their owner did what historians and what individuals at the time referred to as being refugeed. So his owner refugeed them to Mississippi and compelled them to leave the district and leave Edward behind. And then 1 year after John placed his first Lost Friends advertisement, he still hadn't found Edward. So he placed another, this time offering more detail. And so each of these advertisements made one point clear. Angelica Chu, although as you can see here, he spells her name differently in both advertisements, but nevertheless, he identifies Angelica Chu as the woman who owned him and his family, who orchestrated the separation via that process of refugeeing, and that she was the reason that him and his family were still searching for Edward. So initially, it was difficult for me to find Angelica, in large part because of these kind of variations in spelling and the ways in which he refers to her in these advertisements. So as you can see in the first yellow box on the left, he refers to her as Miss Angelica Chu, and the widow of Frisby Chu with PH. And so I said, okay, jot that down. So then I went to the second advertisement. I said, okay, well, he's saying something completely different the second time. Like, who is this the same person? Like, what's going on here? So you can see he refers to her as Mrs. Angelo Chu. And so I said, okay, well, I know that in this period, and even sometimes today, when a woman is married, and even if a woman is widowed, she may be referred to as Mrs., but by her husband's first and last name. So I said, well, okay, is she the widow of Angelo Chu? Like, what's going on here? So I'm looking at the details. I'm like, okay, we know that they lived in, we know that he's in Yazoo, Mississippi now. We know that he was in Georgetown because he says that. And we know that this woman's last name is Chu, either spelled with a U or spelled with an E. We'll figure it out. So I started to enter that information into, as luck would have it, Ancestry.com. I know they've been in some trouble lately, but nevertheless, it's a wonderful resource where you can find many of the really extraordinary archival documents that the National Archives has available on site here. And so I was able to find Frisby. So I said, wait, there he is. So I found Frisby Freeland Chu. I found Angelica's husband. His obituary in this newspaper. And not only does it, obituaries are really interesting, even though they're macabre, they're very dark, very depressing pieces of kind of archival fragments, if you want to call them that. But nevertheless, they often give these really rich descriptions of these people's lives, of the deceased person's life, and you can really see kind of migrations, you can see all kinds of things, and that's what's apparent in Frisby's obituary. So it tells us that, yes, he was married to Mrs. Chu. It does not identify her by name, but he does refer to Yazoo County, Mississippi, which is where James Skinner is at the time he placed his Lost Friends advertisements. So we have that. That's one corroboration. Then he talks about, it talks about his children. It talks about the fact that he was on his way to the government at Washington. So it tells us that he had been appointed to a governmental position, which would, again, explain, not only corroborate what James Skinner is talking about, or placing him and Edward and his family in D.C., but also why they were in D.C. and how the heck, where the connection between Yazoo County, Mississippi, and D.C. came from. So it tells us why the Chus were in Washington, D.C., and then it tells us how he died. And so this was a really interesting component because, again, it corroborates what James is saying, this formerly enslaved person is saying, but it also gives some details about Angelica's life, her migrations, how she's moving around the country or parts of the country at this moment. And then, I'm about to have a super nerdy moment for you, on you. But then I found Angelica Chu's father's will. For those who are into genealogy, for those who are into any kind of history, that this is like archival gold. And so for me, it was really important, again, because it underscored not simply these kind of parental relationships between parents and daughters and the ways in which their inheritance practices almost ensured that white women who received enslaved people would be deeply and profoundly invested in the institution and its perpetuation, and even in continuing to invest economically in the institution by buying and selling enslaved people after they received inheritance such as this one. But it also shows how they were able to maintain control over and exercise control over the enslaved people that they inherited. So how does it do that? So in this yellow box, what it says, and I'll just read it to you, because it is not, I think immediately apparent to a lot of you what it says. So it says, I'm going to say it in a very, what I would imagine George Washington Biscoe might sound like in these moments. Having made gifts by way of advancement to my dear daughter Angelica Chu, and desiring to make my dear daughter Emma's share of my estate proportionate with her said sisters, I give and bequeath to my dear wife Anne Marie Biscoe, in trust for the sole and separate use of our said daughter Emma, the following servants. And then he describes the servants that Emma will receive. So why is this important? Why did I get excited about this? So what it tells us is that Angelica, sometime during the course of her life, before her father died, he gave her portion of his estate. And that's important for me and important for us to understand, I think, in large part because when we think about slavery, sometimes we think about inheritances, we often think that happens just when a person dies and that when they leave a particular heir property in their will. But what this shows is that, and this is an argument that I make in the book, is that slave-owning parents didn't just leave their daughters enslaved people as their property in their wills. They gave them enslaved people over the course of their lives, even from infancy, as birthday gifts, as Christmas presents, and especially as wedding gifts. So they would often give them a group of enslaved people, as I mentioned earlier, upon notification that they were going to get married. So they would typically have a ritual at the recital. So the the reception. So I didn't have a reception because I was poor when I got married, so I didn't have a reception. But during the reception, they would essentially line up the enslaved people, and then there would be kind of an announcement made at the wedding reception that essentially granted the wife, the daughter, the newlywed daughter, her wedding present, which would involve which would entail a group of enslaved people. So what George Washington Biscoe is saying here is that he already gave Angelica her share, and that likely means that she received those enslaved people at the time of her wedding or sometime over the course of after she got married. Okay, so that's one thing that really important thing that it shows, and what it also reflects is that as historians and as genealogists, that we can look elsewhere to try to make these connections, that wills are important, but that they're not the end-all, be-all to understanding property bequests, property transfers between white Southerners or any folks that had the ability to own property and to transfer that property to someone else. What it also shows is an important legal clause that many slaveholding parents not only built into their wills, as we see here, but also in trust estates. So these would be very much like trust funds that are established for wealthy folks these days. And so we're familiar with trust funds. So what slaveholding parents would often do as well is if they gave their daughters property before they married or before they died in their wills, like we see here, they would do so by creating a trust. And they would put that property in a trust, appoint a trustee. Sometimes it'd be the husband, sometimes it'd be the father or a male family member. Sometimes it was even a woman. As you see here, George appoints his wife as Emma's trustee. So he creates a separate trust estate, a separate trust fund for Emma, and he puts Anne in charge of that estate, that property, until she comes of age. And he states here the underlined clause. He puts in that really important clause, in trust for the sole and separate use of our said daughter, Emma. This has such power in a legal context, because what it says, what it's making clear, is that George Washington did not want Emma's future husband to have any control over the property that he was giving to Emma. And so by saying in trust for the sole and separate use of Emma, he is essentially telling her husband, ha ha ha, you thought you were going to get your grubby hands on this property, but no. So slave-owning parents and their daughters are working together before they get to the point in which women might be fearful that their husbands might dispose of their property in ways that they do not agree with. You also might be wondering why that would be necessary. Some of you may know that when a woman, a single woman or a widowed woman, got married or remarried in this period, there was a legal doctrine referred to as coverture, which essentially said that upon marriage, any of the property that those women brought into marriage, any property that they might acquire after marriage, either by inheritance or by purchase, would automatically become her husband's. After that point, after marriage, she wasn't able to enter into contracts in her own name, to create a business in her own name, and to go into court and sue on her own behalf. So what this particular clause does is it circumvents some of those constraints. It circumvents the property and wealth constraint. So it essentially allows for Emma to maintain control of any property that she brings into the marriage. In order to continue to own property after the marriage, he would have had to have this will entered into the court and authorized or recognized by the courts, authenticated by the courts. And this is something that he certainly did, because we have the record here. If we didn't, it'd probably be in some private paper somewhere, and we'd never know it existed. So this is a really important way, not only that slave-owning parents ensured that their daughters would not be at the will of husbands that might not have their best interests in mind, but also how they were able to continue to secure ownership over enslaved people and to maintain control over them, even when the law on the books looks like they shouldn't have that ability and have that power and control. So this is one of those documents that got me really excited. And I was also able to find this extraordinary document. So at the beginning of my comments, actually during the introduction, you were told about the D.C. Emancipation Act. So on April 16, 1862, D.C. did in fact pass the Emancipation Act in the District of Columbia, which provided compensation for any slaveholders that were willing to accept the abolition of the emancipation of enslaved people in the district, and if they were willing to do that and then submit an application for compensation listing the enslaved people that they were claiming as their own, they could in fact receive a sum of money from the federal government to pay them for the enslaved people that they owned and that they were willing to allow to be free and emancipated. This is Angelica Chu's emancipation application for compensation. Application for compensation after emancipation. I think that's a better way to refer to it. And what it also shows is exactly some of the information, those details. It corroborates some of the same details that James Skinner provided in his Lost Friends ad. So in the yellow box on the left, it shows the names of Ann Biscoe, who's Angelica's mother, Angelica's name, as well as Emma's name. So again, it goes back to the will, and it also goes back in some ways to James Skinner's information that he details in those advertisements. But it lists James Skinner, and some of his siblings, as well as his mother, in the yellow box. At that time, their surnames was Gray. And so he states that in his Lost Friends ad. So these are some of the ways that I operated as I wrote this book, using those really interesting and seemingly disconnected fragments of information that James provided in those Lost Friends ads. I was able to dig a little deeper and find all of these other archival documents that were elsewhere, legal documents, obituaries, so newspaper advertisements, as well as Civil War era financial documents. Would be considered illegal, but also a financial document to corroborate some of the information that James was telling us, but also tracing and trying to reconstruct some details of Angelica Chu's life as well. And so what I think is also interesting is that it wasn't just formerly enslaved people that were talking about white women's economic investments in the institution. There were a host of other individuals and entities that similarly described or documented white slave-owning women's economic investments in the institution, their slave ownership. So at the very top, the federal government did in fact document white women's slave ownership in the census. So what's really interesting about the census, which you have ample access to through the NARA, is that in 1840, the census looks very different than it does in 1850 and 1860. So in 1840, the census looks very much like the patriarchal household that we envision in the 19th century. So it documented and identified by name simply the male head of household. And if there was a female head of household because she might be a widow, it would identify that individual by name. And then all the other inhabitants in that household, all the other residents in that household would simply be checked off under these categories. So like women, white women, age, 0 to 12, and they not, check off all these little boxes and enumerate individuals, but they wouldn't name them. They wouldn't identify them by name. So you couldn't tell who owned property in that household, whether women owned enslaved people in that household. It just kind of bunched all of the other residents in that household together. But in 1850 and 1860, well, 1850, people, I guess, thought it was important to say, hey, we have all these enslaved people living in the country. Probably be a good idea to know just how many there are. So they started to count them. Unfortunately, they didn't name enslaved people in the 1850 census and then in the 1860 census. But what they did start to do is name the residents of white households, identify them by name, no matter whether they were male or female. So we can gather that information. But they also started to enumerate individual slave holdings throughout the nation. So what you see here is a page out of the Tennessee census reflecting the slave holding of Mrs. Sarah M. Rhodes. So it identifies the person who owns the slaves for the very first time. You're seeing this at the federal level anyway. And then it enumerates the total number of enslaved people that she is claiming as her own. And so you can see she had a pretty sizable slave holding. This number is pretty typical. So the typical slaveholder wasn't the person who owned 1,000 slaves. There were actually slaveholders that owned thousands of slaves, particularly in Louisiana. But the typical slave owner owned 10 enslaved people or less. Women typically owned 5 or less. So these women that I talk about in the book are in fact part of the majority of slaveholders, which admittedly were a small number of Southerners. So I'm not arguing in any way in this book or at this talk that slave owners were all Southerners. They were a small percentage of all Southerners, but women, they were among the majority of slaveholders, meaning that they typically owned 10 enslaved people or less. Sarah owns a few more than 10. So she's right on the edge of becoming, a more, what would be considered an elite slaveholder here. But this makes it possible now to be able to say, not simply that there were, slave-owning women, but actually to tell us just how many there may have been, to provide calculations, concrete numbers for those who are hungry for numbers, because some historians are really hungry for numbers. And so by looking at census data, I've been looking at census data for several years now and collecting it and looking specifically at slave-owning women, the slaveholding women in the census data, I've been able to see to show that in some regions, women may have constituted up to 40% of slaveholders. Prior estimates placed them at 10%. So by looking at the rich sources, some of which are available here at NARA, like the census information, I'm able to start to piece together some of the kind of details that are really important for us to know as a nation. In particular, how these women are not simply invested economically in the institution of slavery, but also in kind of racially divided social order that characterized our nation and continues to shape our encounters with each other today. And at the state level, so that was at the federal level, but at the state level, what I thought was really interesting is that, on the one hand, I talked about the legal doctrine of coverture. I talked about how, the law of coverture says that women shouldn't have the ability to own property after they get married, exercise all of these different kind of legal and economic, to engage in all these legal and economic activities. But at the same time, you have state laws like this one from Missouri that identify women and recognize white women as slaveholders right in the laws. So this law is essentially reflective of, kind of what they call black codes. So these are laws that were specifically pertaining to the actions of enslaved people and also free black people who would often constitute the minority in this period. But what you see here is that there are constant references to the mistress, constant references to not belonging to him or her, not to be her own, her plantation or tenement. So the laws on the books of our states in this moment are not simply saying, hey, this woman may exercise a certain kind of power in her husband's stead, or if there are no men around. The law is actually saying she is equally empowered, equally emboldened by the law to engage with, to interact with enslaved people in this way, to behave in these particular ways. But it also recognizes that the law holds these slave-owning women accountable for enslaved people's misdeeds. So that's huge. That's huge. But the laws at the state level are recognizing the importance that women's ownership, but also their importance to maintaining a system of surveillance that keeps enslaved people in their place. And what's also really interesting is that at the city level, what you see is that cities like New Orleans they need laborers, and slave-owning women had them. So they would often contract with slave-owning women, as they did with other slave owners in the city, to work on public works. And so here, what you see is a receipt that was issued by the city of New Orleans to Miss Eliza Farrell for Rose's work on the public works. So she received $1.50, which is a pretty significant amount for that period of time, for Rose's labor. So again, the cities are documenting the property ownership, the slave ownership of white women in the South. Now, this document probably looks really funky to you guys from over there, from out there, but what it shows, again, is a way in which the city municipal officials recognize women as slave owners. So in New Orleans, this is if you've never been, I highly recommend it. It's an extraordinary city where it's kind of characterized by this really vibrant, small mercantile culture. So there are all these peddlers, what we refer to as peddlers or vendors, that kind of, are immerse you in like all kinds of products and things in the city. And white women were a part of that mercantile culture. And so the city is really interested in finding out who all these merchants are. They are issuing licenses to these merchants, and they want to know who needs a license. So they begin to create a census specifically of the merchants in the city. And this is a page out of that census. And so what you see here, the first red arrow, is Madame Harriet. So Madame Harriet is operating an oyster restaurant on Gravier and Philippa Streets. And not far from her are two slave traders, C.F. Hatcher, who's quite notorious for his engagement in the slave trade, as well as D. Weiss or David Wise on towards the bottom. And so what this shows is that there are these ideas that the slave market was a vice, that it was kind of kind of centered, like put in a little dark corner of the city, and you only went there, kind of like a red light district. Like I think people think of the slave market as operating in red light districts, but that wasn't the case at all. What this reflects is that this kind of commerce, the slave trade, the purchase and sale of enslaved people, was central to the commercial districts of New Orleans, and that women were a part of those commercial districts. So there was no way that women could avoid slave markets. Even if they never bought a slave, they could not avoid encountering the slave market, and even in some cases benefiting from offering their goods or their services to those individuals who were invested in and involved in the slave trade. And that is not how that is supposed to look. So I apologize for that. But essentially, let's see. So there were, I can tell you what it's supposed to look like. So this would have been, if it had behaved itself, been a newspaper advertisement placed by a local jailer. So when an enslaved person ran away and was captured, people would take those captured runaways to their local jailer, and then the local jailer would then interrogate that enslaved person. So they would ask them what their names were, where they came from, and who owned them. And they would take that information and post it in the newspaper. And in there they would say, this person says that they belong to you. If you are the rightful owner of this person, come down to the jail, bring proof of ownership, and then you can take them away. And so in this particular advertisement that you do not see, there was an enslaved man who ran away, and the local jailer asked him who he belonged to, and he identified a female slave owner a female owner in his advertisement. So this is all these ways in which there are, at the municipal level, the federal level, at the state level, city level, and on these kind of individual levels, you see people identifying women as invested in the institution of slavery. And so what you see here is a slave trader's account book. So when a slave trader, the most meticulous ones, when they purchased enslaved people, they would identify the enslaved person, sometimes by name, most often not by name, by age. They would say how much they paid for that person, and then who they sold that person to, and for what amount. And this page out of John White's slave trade account book reflects the fact that he sold enslaved people to the same woman, Mrs. R. Johnson, 4 times. So it reflects also the profit margin for the enslaved people that he sold to her as well. And when those sales were finalized, places like South Carolina actually had pre-printed bills of sale. These are very much like receipts that we receive today when we buy something. So it would say, well, in this particular case, Elizabeth Morrison sold an enslaved woman to a notorious South Carolina slave trader named Ziba B. Oaks for $410. Again, it sounds like a very small amount, but there's a website that you can use if you're interested called Measuring Worth. And you can actually put in the amount of money that the individual was purchased for or sold for, and it will tell you, it will calculate how much purchasing power that amount of money will have today. And so using Measuring Worth to do that, I was able to calculate that $410 would have been the equivalent of $13,600 in 2018 money. So that's a small amount back then, it seems, or today it seems, but not necessarily back then. It was an extraordinary amount of money. And so this receipt reflects the fact that women not only owned enslaved people, but they engaged in the selling and the purchase of enslaved people too, and did so and connected and interacted with slave traders, something that other historians have suggested that they didn't do on a regular basis. But looking at these kinds of documents reflects the fact that they did, in fact, do so on a regular basis. And I think what's really interesting about this one here is so H. Bonnabel is a man. He's actually, there's the part of the highway in New Orleans named after this guy. It's just really interesting to see that how in the city like New Orleans, slavery is everywhere, but nowhere at the same time. But anyway, so H. Bonnabel is trying to hunt Lucy down. So Lucy ran away from him, and he is trying to find Lucy. And what's really interesting is that he identifies 3 of Lucy's previous owners. And so he says Captain Kelly owned her at one time, then Mrs. Toogood owned her, and then Mrs. Clark owned her. And by doing so, he creates this chain of ownership that allows for us to see not only kind of violence of the market, the ways in which enslaved people were passed from person to person to person, but also the important role that white women played in those that chain as well. The roles that their location on those chains, that they were in fact links, but also that they were too implicit. They were also complicit in and involved in creating these separations through the process of sale as well. And you probably can't see this very clearly from where you are, but during the Civil War, the Confederacy needed fortifications to protect themselves, as did federal troops. And they would often impress enslaved people from local slave owners to commandeer that work, to get that work done. They wouldn't do it without paying them, though. So they would keep track of the payments that they issued to the slaveholders whose slaves had been impressed into constructing these fortifications. And this is what was called the Confederate Slave Payroll, a document that is housed in the National Archives here, and there are thousands and thousands and thousands of them. And what it shows is that women were counted among the slaveholders whose enslaved people were impressed by the Confederacy, but also that they were some of those who were paid for the work that those enslaved men, typically men, did. So you have Eliza Sims is listed let's see if I can, yeah, so Eliza Sims and her son are listed there. You have Mary Sims there. Let's see where I can find the other one. Oh, there's Ann Mansfield there. And even though her name there are initials here, this is Ella V. Crosby. So that I found that corroborated that in additional documents beyond the slave payroll. But what this also shows, again, is that one of the things that's really interesting when people ask me about the numbers is they say, well, how many are there? And I talk about the difficulties with coming to a precise quantity because of things like this. So the fact that Ella is listed not as Ella but as E.V. Crosby makes it sometimes difficult to know the complete number of enslaved people, slave-owning women, because of the fact that they were often referred to in the documents only by their initials. So you're unable to identify them, whether they were women or not in some cases. So that makes it difficult to come to a concrete number more broadly, but it's just a hiccup along the way. But nevertheless, it shows that women, even into the Civil War era, are benefiting from the labor of enslaved people. And then even into, again, the Civil War era, you see that slave-owning women are hunting down enslaved people, and even when you would think the jig is up, it's this April 9th, that Lee surrenders, they are still hunting down enslaved people. And so ultimately, these are the kinds of documents that I used to construct the narrative that I tell, and they were her property. And it becomes, after I kind of have been working on this book for 10 years, this is what I hope the book does. It takes a picture, this image. You can find this image in hundreds of books, if not thousands of books, and rarely is anyone interested in what I highlight here, which is that there are many women, many children that are at the auction, even though it's a pictorial illustration that it may be based on fact, may not be based on fact, but nevertheless, women were everywhere. They were hiding in plain sight. It just takes a little bit more, a more closer kind of perspective, a lens upon which to kind of show their presence and their roles and their importance in the institution more broadly. So thank you so much, everybody, for listening and for being here.
Stephanie, unfortunately, we're out of time. We won't be able to take any questions,
Oh my goodness,
especially if you need to catch your airplane.
I'm so sorry. I didn't know that. I'm sorry. Well, thank you so much, everybody. There's a book signing following, so if you'd like to ask a question, please feel free to come over there and ask me. I apologize for sucking up all the time.
Folks, there will be a book signing one level up at the Archives bookstore. We'll see you up there in just a few moments. Books are at the cash registers.
Thank you. Thank you so much.